L. Willets. The date is Saturday, August 30th, 2003. The location is the Antique Airplane Association Library near Blakesburg, Iowa. The interviewer is Zach Bothman, Timeless Voices of Aviation Program Coordinator. Could you please state your full name and spell it?
Well, Richard or Dick Willets, and that's D-I-C-K, Richard, of course, common spelling, L for Lee, Willets, W-I-L-L-E-T-T-S.
What was your date of birth?
December the 5th, 1926.
And where were you born?
Albia, Iowa, A-L-B-I-A.
What is your present address?
209 West Benton, B-E-N-T-O-N, Albia.
Could you talk about your childhood, what your parents did, and the first time that you noticed an airplane or an aircraft or whatever it might be?
Well, my childhood. My father was a railway postal clerk. He worked mail on trains, and I was born in Albia, and he worked between there and Albert Lee, Minnesota. First time I remember airplanes, I think I couldn't have been more than 6 or 8 years old. I never heard of airplanes before, and I had a cousin that had a model airplane there, and I found out about airplanes and never got over it. Just, you know, I went whole hog with that, and that was all I could think about from there on. And I always hoped that I'd, you know, fly for a living. I've done a little bit of that, but basically I went into the same thing my dad was in. I was a railway postal clerk a little bit before I went to service while I was waiting to be called. And then after I came home from service, I went back into that, and that was spending most of my career was railway postal service until they took the trains off, and then I finished up in the post office. So I had 47 years in the postal service.
Which could be a whole nother interview, I think.
Well, maybe. Yeah, I think I probably have a few stories there.
Do you recall Pearl Harbor, the attack on
Yes,
Pearl
I
Harbor?
do. I do. 41, I don't know how old was I, about 15 or something like that.
Do you recall what you were doing when you found out?
No, I was probably playing outdoors. But specifically, no, I didn't know where Pearl Harbor was, and I didn't realize the gravity of it when I heard, and then they began to talk about, well, we're at war and this and that, and then I began to find out what it was all about.
Did you follow the war? Because you were still in high school during most of it.
Yeah. Did I follow it? You had to. I mean, it was everything. I mean, the rationing and the whole bit. And, of course, I wanted to fly P-51s and fighter planes and so forth. So I took the examination for the Air Corps. And then I guess they changed it. I'm not sure what year they changed the Army, Air Force, and then the Air Force. But anyway, I was too young to get in it. They didn't call me to active service until April of '45. And so when they closed the cadet program the day I got out of ground basic, and so I didn't get to fly. But they kept me in and sent me off to be a mechanic. They probably found out I didn't have any mechanical ability, and they said, well, that's a good place for you. We'll give you some. Anyway, that isn't something I enjoy, is working on airplanes. I just like to fly them.
What kind of airplanes were you working on?
I went to a fighter group. I went to school at Biloxi, Mississippi, down at Keesler Field, and learned on B-24s. And then when I got overseas, they put me in a fighter outfit, and it was the 38th Fighter Squadron in the 55th Fighter Group. And this was in Germany. And we had P-51s, and then soon after I got there, within 3 or 4 months, I think, it must have been about February, probably about March or so, when we got the P-80s. And so then I worked on both of them. I was the crew chief on both. But the old guys were going home, and I was one of the new ones to come in to replace them, you know.
What year did you go over to Germany?
That was that was still in 1945. I got in what was it? Fürstenfeldbruck? No, wait a minute. What was it? I forgot. Near Munich on Thanksgiving Day of 1945.
Did you have any interaction with German people?
Oh, some. No close association, really. the war was just over. Things were still blown up. And, the place was a real mess. But the people were industrious, friendly, so on and so forth, and they got dug right in and got things going again. When I first got there, you would go to a city of any size and it was rubble everywhere, and it was just been cleared enough for tracks to go through and things like the buildings.
Were people higher up talking about the Russians? I mean, was there...
I didn't hear anything like that. The first I remember that we had any problem with the Russians, I got a furlough to go to Switzerland, and I remember I was in Mulhouse, France. There, just entering, getting ready to go into Switzerland, and I began to hear talking about the Russians, you know, as an opponent. I thought they were our friends, you know, during the war. I mean, it was just because it was convenient for them to be our friends, I believe. But no, I didn't know anything about that until after the War II was over.
How long were you in Germany?
Oh, about 11 months, I think it was.
What was it like working on those first jets?
Well, when they had some of those in the Pacific at the latter part of the war, it was mostly remove and replace. When we first got them, we didn't even have wing tanks, and I think they were good for about an hour and 15 minutes or something like that without. Of course, the whole wing was basically fuel tank and the big tank behind, but at low altitude they burned a lot of fuel. Higher, they would last quite a bit longer, but once we got the wing tanks, right. But we had a lot of bugs to work out of them.
Were there a lot of accidents in those first few jets?
While I was there, I only remember one guy ran out of fuel and landed, but they tell me that thing's like a great big glider. If you've got enough altitude, it's very clean and everything, and when it has no fuel in it, it makes a wonderful glider. I guess they can go a long ways.
Huh. After you were done in Germany after that 11 months, were you still in the force, or were you discharged?
I was discharged. I got to come home, and I was discharged in November of '46.
And when did you start flying?
Before I went to service, I was 17 years old. I had taken the Air Corps test, and I was just waiting to be called. I went to Chicago and worked in the mail service. I had taken different examinations and things. That was one I passed, and thought, well, that'd be a good place to go. And I was fresh out of high school, never been out of town hardly, you know. I went to Chicago. That was a big deal, but it was fun. And then I went to service, came back, went back to Chicago again, worked there. And then I got married back home and went into the railway postal service, actually working on trains in Chicago there. Mostly I just worked in the post office building, but it was the railway mail service.
When did you earn your license?
My pilot's license?
Mm-hmm.
Well, let's see. I soloed in 1944 in October. I didn't get my private license until 1940, probably 47. I came back home. I believe it was 47. I can't remember just exactly, but I came back home and started taking lessons there. I had had a few lessons in the Chicago area there. But yeah, I think it was probably 47 when I got my private license. Might even have been 48, I can't remember.
Did you just fly for fun then?
Yeah, you know, there were so many military pilots, there wasn't a chance in any place, you know, of flying for a living. So I didn't even think of the possibility of it. I guess later on I might have gotten back in, but by that time I was married and things were going along, buying a house and all this stuff.
How did you get into airshow flying?
Well, let's see. I guess you might say, let's see, I wonder if the statute of limitations has expired. We had this PA-11, I believe it was, like a Piper Cub, you know, at the old airstrip south of town there. And I was out, and I always kind of liked to get a hold of an airplane, kind of see what it will do, you know, and within reason, or at least what I thought was reason in those days. out the old airport, and I was just kind of horsing around out there in this airplane and bouncing on one wheel and this and that, and pretty soon it was right alongside a highway there, and pretty soon the cars started to pull off over the side. And this friend of mine, who's a kind of a character, most of my friends are, come to think of it. Oh, well, anyway, he got out there and he began to ham it up a little bit. He saw what was happening too, so he started this thing. I was flying and bouncing around. He'd start hollering at me, and he even got up on this little place where the windsock was and shook the windsock and pointed and hollered, and boy, pretty soon we had a whole bunch of cars out there, and then I just came in and made a real nice soft landing, and this little car door started slamming everybody. No blood on the runway. I guess that's kind of the way I got started, and then pretty soon, maybe there was a picnic or something. This was back in the days things maybe were a little more liberal, and I remember I was putting on a small show somewhere for some little deal, and this fella come back out of a small crowd there. He said, "That nice show you got there, Dick." He says, "Do you know that you can do that legally?" I said, "Oops." I'm so-and-so with the FAA. I won't mention any names. He may have passed on by now, but anyway, you wouldn't get away with that stuff today. But he said, "I tell you what you do." He says, you just write down the maneuvers that you do, describe them, and send it to me, and I'll fix you up with a waiver. And that's what it was. That was it. But like I say, that wouldn't happen today, but that's the way I got started.
So, can you describe your act?
Oh, I don't know how. I never really thought about describing it. It's a comedy acro in a J3 Cub, or I also did it in a Champ, but mostly a Cub, and I still got the same 1946 J3 Cub. It's basically uncoordinated flying. Well, I guess you'd say it's coordinated, but all bouncing on one wheel, pulling up real steep. It's a very forgiving airplane, and you can do things in that you wouldn't dare try on a lot of other ones. But it just kind of worked up to it gradually. I can remember I never had any aerobatic instruction, but I read everything I'd get a hold of. And then I'd go out and scare myself, and with plenty of altitude, and I thought about not overstressing the airplane anyway.
How many shows did you fly in a year?
In a season? I think the most I ever flew was about 20. But when you stop and think that maybe the season runs about 3 or 4 months, that's quite a few. And in the latter years, I didn't do very many. Basically, my air shows were within the surrounding states, Iowa and surrounding states. Well, I did a few a little farther away once in a while, but mostly they were just more or less surrounding states.
Did regulations for the kind of flying you were doing change over the years? And did they have an effect on you at all?
I don't know as they changed all that much. The thing is, it wasn't really standardized, and there were different interpretations of the regulations. So one place might give you a hard time, the other place said, well, that's perfectly fine. But really, I got along very well with the FAA and tried to fly safe air shows and put on a good show for the public. So I enjoyed it a lot, and I'd still be enjoying it, but I decided I didn't want to go along with some of the things that are the FAA kind of turned it over to somebody else, and I don't want to jump through any more hoops. I just want to fly for fun now. So that's what I'm doing.
Did you ever have a harrowing experience in your act, or flying in general, for that matter?
I think I promised God several times that if he'd just get me out of this, I would never do that again. But he keeps forgiving me, and he keeps taking care of me. So, yes, I had some. I don't have any that I really want to describe because it makes me feel stupid when I tell these things, you know. But yeah, I've had a few. But thankfully, there's a wooden floor. I never hurt myself. Never hurt my airplane much. Well, maybe I flew through a couple of wires once. That kind of put some nicks and dents in it. Things like that, you know. You can't. I think the only people that really don't ever damage an airplane at all are the ones that don't fly an awful lot. That isn't saying that's not 100% true. There's some real careful pilots that are good pilots too. But if you try to fly along the edge a little bit, why, you got to watch what you're doing. Altitude and airspeed.
Would you say that your comedy antics have improved your flying ability?
Oh, definitely, definitely. I think a J3 Cub is one of the best trainers ever built. It's such a forgiving airplane. You can make mistakes and live to tell about it and learn from them. But I don't think there was ever a better comedy act than the J3 Cub. Well, I've done it with other airplanes, but it's a very forgiving airplane.
Do you have any, besides your act, which is obviously comedy, do you have any humorous stories that you'd like to share?
I hadn't stopped to think about it. I probably would if I could think about it, but right at the moment I don't come up with any. Not too long ago. Well, I don't want to tell about that one. No. If we got the, talking, I'd probably come up with several, but right at the moment I don't think of any.
What's been your most memorable aviation experience?
Most memorable? Gosh, I don't know.
One that really stands out.
It's just been great all the way. I can't think of a single one that's outstanding. I've enjoyed the air show flying, and just flying in general. I had a Swift for a long time, a Globe Swift, and that was a pretty good aerobatic airplane, except for snaps and spins. It would roll very nicely, and it was a fun airplane to fly. Kind of like a little fighter in a way. But I can't think of any one thing that stands out particularly.
Was airshow flying very profitable?
Well, no, I doubt very much if there's more than a dozen pilots in the United States that fly full-time air shows and make a profit out of it. What it did for me was allow me to buy some airplanes that I would have been able to buy anyway, but it helped maintain them. Yeah, it helped pay for my airplanes. And this is the big part of my life, is aviation.
So for you, it wasn't about profit, it was more for fun and just flying in general? Yeah,
it was an avocation rather than vocation. But when I stop and think about it, I think maybe I was better off I didn't get to be a fighter pilot. I might have been shot down or something, but that's what I wanted to do originally. But I've had so much fun. I've so many friends in aviation, so many of them that just say, go ahead and fly my airplane, and it's marvelous. Met lots of nice people.
For someone who's might just be starting out, do you have any advice for that person on starting out flying, or maybe starting out airshow work?
Things have changed so much. I'm not so sure that I could give any information on that. Things have changed a lot. No, I can't say. Just keep on keeping on is all I know.
Would you say things have changed for the better?
Well, no. The opposite. Really. Oh, some things have changed for the better. There's all kinds of technology and things that have improved. Take that little GPS now. It makes a lazy navigator out of you. That was one of the stories I was about to tell. I ended up in the wrong town because that thing went out and I was depending on it. I had to go back the old way with a map, a sectional map. Well, I didn't have the map where I could get at it, and so that got a little, well, it really wasn't all that embarrassing, but that's a story I better not get into.
It's happened to a lot of people, though.
Oh, you bet. I mean,
right,
it makes you a lazy navigator, but they sure are nice, especially if you really get in a bind. They tell you right where you are and how long it's going to take you to get there and all that kind of stuff.
Is there anything that I haven't covered, and I know I haven't covered a lot, but is there any story that you'd like to share, a flying story?
Can't think of anything right now. In fact, you got a lot more out of me than I knew I had to talk about.
Well, I thank you for sharing your time and your story with me, Dick, and I appreciate it. And Timeless Voices appreciate it.
Thank you, Zach.